Amen.
You probably haven't taken much time to notice them, and certainly not this time of year. They're likely covered with snow, or your eye wouldn't be able to draw a contrast between them and their white background. However, as a cyclist, they're always the first thing I notice when I'm riding through a new neighborhood. They're a series of white flags demarcating the perimeter of someone's property. And they're not there to enforce the idea of this is my territory, stay off. They're not there to proclaim a party or some other gathering. In fact, the flags aren't even there for us to notice. They're there for the dogs to observe. Of course, I'm talking about the invisible dog fence. And I imagine you know how they work. The dog is given a collar with a small shocking device that is triggered whenever the dog crosses the designated perimeter, which is demarcated by those white flags. The small electric shock doesn't really hurt the dog, but it does get its attention. Eventually the dog begins to notice that the shock occurs when she gets close to those white flags. I say she because if it was a male dog, he'd never notice. I'm sorry. It's a female crowd, so I got to play the crowd, right? They learn to stay clear of the limit. And soon the pet owner doesn't need to put batteries in the collar at all. And eventually the white flags come down altogether. For our pet now knows the safe limits of where to go. I've been fascinated by these invisible fences ever since I learned about them. Unfortunately, I didn't discover them until after the last dog that I owned was hit by a car, due to a literal, actual fence being left open back when I was 11. While it's doubtful that this is the garment of salvation that Isaiah is describing, there is little doubt in my mind that such a collar would have saved my beloved coffee. Of course, these fences aren't perfect. They have their own liabilities too. They also have a way of limiting the world or the experience of our dogs, limiting their steps until they gain a little too much weight, until they don't go outside anymore altogether, and they're bored and they just stay home watching Netflix, if we have Netflix for dogs. Losing my dog was one of the first losses in my life, and I remember how much it stung. It was one of the first times that I learned how much love makes us vulnerable. We tend not to notice it, kind of like the invisible fence, until we feel the shock of pain. This is one of the primary realizations of growing up and aging. We learn that love hurts. It hurts, but it's worth it. Life without love is like a dog confined to the narrowest patch of lawn. It's better to risk for the sake of love and lose than not risk at all. Let me tell you, as a cyclist, I've learned that there are very few fences, visible or invisible, that can stop a determined dog chasing after a brightly illumined cyclist. Most of the time, the fence is merely a visual reminder for us as humans, too, that we're rewarded by complying and capitulating to the rules. The rule of love, of course, ignores the fence. And just like the trained dog, the fence is mostly in our head. I can't love that person. That won't be safe. And perhaps it won't be. Fences are there for a purpose, too. Don't get me wrong. However, I think that crossing the fence is really what Christmas is all about. Crossing the fence from the infinite to the finite, from the eternal to the now. And there's no doubt in my mind that God suffered a severe shock of vulnerability during that original Christmas. I can only imagine, as a father, how God must have felt in giving us Jesus. I remember when my first son, Aiden, who's back there running the computer, when he came into the world, how vulnerable it made me feel, and how powerless I was to protect him. I can't imagine if I had all the power in the universe and I could protect him, sending him out into that vulnerability. And yet, in the form of this frail and vulnerable baby, the fullness of God's love is incarnated in the flesh of one beating human heart. The poetry of John's language in today's gospel masks, I think, some of the inherent riskiness of God's plan. That third-person omniscient narration lends an air of certitude and presents what on the surface is a powerful statement of God infiltrating the world. I think, in fact, that the opening prologue of John's gospel is very much like a trailer to a movie. You can almost hear Don Wardo's voice. In a world where God was alone with God's self, God spoke through his word, and everything was created. The Word was the light and the life of all peoples, and the darkness could never overcome it. After such a trailer, such as you can imagine, a movie is going to come that's packed with action and heroic feats. And this is precisely how Jesus is portrayed in John's Gospel. As the last Gospel written, the author wrote it in such a way as to spread this message to the whole world and to the Gentiles, and not just the Hebrew mind. Because the Gentiles, they hadn't been waiting for a Messiah. They didn't know who King David was, and they didn't care. They didn't even know to look for a Messiah. The Greco-Roman mind, however, did understand the concept of an ordering word, or a logos in Greek. They could appreciate the need for the word, the logos, to come down to embody a saving logic, to bring order to our disordered passions. Although this gospel's passage is written in these logical and poetic terms, the event that it's describing is the story of one small baby born to a teenage unwed mother in a manger in a stable in the town of Bethlehem some 2,000 years ago, in the definite backwater of society. God spoke a definitive word, but it initially echoed out as a diminutive wail of a baby, a cry for comfort. It is the particularity and the vulnerability of this word that grabs us even till today. It was Jesus. It was the first time that he'd crossed the fence, but it wasn't his last. As a translation of John from another Bible goes, the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. Moved into the neighborhood. Yes, God has moved into our neighborhood, into our flesh and blood. And his Word began to speak of new possibilities and new opportunities, to imagine a world not like the one we've been living in, with all of the walls and the fences and the barriers and the playing it safe, fearful of risk, but of a world of vulnerable, palpable human connection, divine connection. And then things began to be restructured a little bit. It was his voice and the actions of one frail human who was willing to cross boundaries again and again that taught us how to live a life in new and abundant and life-giving, loving ways. That's the story of Christmas. The story that God was willing to cross the boundary for us. And of course, in crossing that boundary, God paid the ultimate price. God ended up rejected because we didn't want to live in that way. We were afraid to live in that way. Maybe we couldn't live in that way. Maybe we were too scared. Who knows? But Christmas presents us with the opportunity to think about what it means to be truly present with one another and not to get caught up in foil wrapping presents and bows and all the rest, but to think about true presence, the way we can enjoy the fact that God became like us, to lift us up, to give us agency and power, to love in ways we never thought possible, to cross boundaries we never imagined, to scale fences that seemed too big and too risky. This Christmas, I wonder, is there a fence set up somewhere in a relationship in your life that needs crossing? Is there some gap that you need to jump across to find connection, to find love? There's a famous poem by Robert Frost that I think speaks to just this need to cross the boundary. His famous poem is called Mending Wall. This is how it goes. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell underneath it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps. Even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I've come after them and made repair where they have not left one stone on stone. But they would not have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean. No one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time, we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And some are loaves, and some so nearly balls that we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. And we wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to a little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why? Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here, there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling out in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only, in the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says it again. Good fences make good neighbors. There's something that doesn't love a wall, despite the fact that we create them all the time in our lives. Walls to keep us safe, walls to keep our stuff safe, walls to protect our dogs, perhaps. In our lives, we need to think long and hard about the boundaries that we erect or that are erected for us. Which fences keep us safe? And which ones allow us just to play it safe? Play it small. To maybe not venture outside. To let our world shrink in around us. Christmas is the time to pay attention to the actions of giving. God first gave to us love, taught us how to love. Love requires that we find ways around those walls, find ways to cross the fence. Any determined person can clearly understand that offense is really just of the mind's making. I think the action of God coming down to us was the ultimate action of realization that we do not need fences. We do need boundaries to keep ourselves safe, yes. But fences don't make good neighbors. They create strangers. This season, God came not as a stranger, but as one of us, so we could learn to be different. God took on flesh and blood and entered our neighborhood to teach us how to be a good neighbor. And that way is the way of love. Merry Christmas. May you cross all the fences that hold you back, but also find safety in the transforming power of love. Amen.